Happy Frazetta Friday, Frazetta fans. I'm Sara, and I'd like to welcome you to another Frazetta Friday with Frazetta Girls. Most everyone knows that my grandfather, Frank Frazetta, was an illustrator, not a gallery painter, and he worked for a variety of commercial clients throughout his career. In tonight's episode, I'm going to cover his work for a magazine client that was more unusual and unexpected than most. The National Lampoon. National Lampoon started as a spin-off of the Harvard Lampoon campus humor magazine, founded by graduates and former Harvard Lampoon staffers Douglas Kenney, Henry Beard, and Robert Hoffman. The first issue appeared in March 1970. With Kenney as editor, Beard as executive editor, and Hoffman as managing editor, they convinced Maddie Simmons, one of the founders of the Diners Club credit card and the Weight Watchers magazine, to serve as a publisher. They may have been funny and ambitious, but none of them really knew what they were doing, which didn't discourage them in the least. The National Lampoon's editors and writers targeted virtually everybody and everything, regardless of race, religion, or gender, often satirically attacking what was considered sacred or off-limits. Nudity and sexual situations in photos, art, and stories were routine. The magazine's humor gleefully pushed far beyond the boundaries of what was generally considered appropriate and acceptable, and bad taste was the norm, which all meant that it sold like hotcakes to the counterculture. It had no specific political stance, but since the war in Vietnam was ongoing and Richard Nixon was in the White House, conservatives were often furious to find themselves regularly in the Lampoon's crosshairs. The staff wore threats of lawsuits from Disney, Volkswagen, and others as badges of honor, and in its height, National Lampoon's had a circulation of over 1 million. Comedy radio shows, stage productions, and record albums became part of the business, and the magazine turned into a springboard for many writers, directors, actors, and projects. Various alumni went on to be a part of Saturday Night Live, The David Letterman Show, and The Simpsons, as well as films like National Lampoon's Animal House, Caddyshack, and National Lampoon's Vacation. Initially, the magazine didn't have an art staff and outsourced design to Peter Bramley's and Bill Skursky's Cloud Studios, an underground comics group who knew little about professional magazine production, and the early issues were a visual mess, until the Lampoon hired Michael C. Gross. Gross had designed the identity of the 1968 Mexico City Olympics and had been the art director for Eye and Family Health magazines, recognizing the opportunities and raw potential of the National Lampoon. The story goes that he sent his resume on a roll of toilet paper to Doug Kenney and was immediately hired. They didn't even know what an art director did, Gross said years later. Maddie wanted a slick magazine so they could attract advertising, and I could give them slick. Gross had to figure out how to improve the magazine with a modest budget. But Marvel Comics happened to be in the same building, so Michael struck up a friendship with Stan Lee, who allowed him to use some of Marvel's colorists, letterers, and production staff, who in turn introduced him to a number of freelance artists. Gahan Wilson, Jeff Jones, Russ Heath, Gray Morrow, and Neil Adams were among the cartoonists and illustrators he subsequently hired. Beginning with the 8th issue, Gross achieved a sophisticated and cohesive look for the magazine, which greatly enhanced its newsstand appeal and overall sales. Many of the National Lampoon's most memorable covers were designed by Gross, including those featuring Lieutenant William Calley as Mads Alfred E. Newman, Che Guevara being splattered with a cream pie, and perhaps most famously, a dog looking nervously as a pistol is pointed at its head with the headline, "If you don't buy this magazine, we'll kill this dog." Like the Harvard Lampoon, individual issues had themes to help provide focus as well as make the editors' jobs easier, including such topics as the future, back to school, death, and here's where my grandpa enters the picture, adventure. Michael had been a fan of my grandfather for many years, dating back to his covers for creepy magazines and the Conan paperbacks, so he took a chance and cold called Frank, offering him the cover spot for National Lampoon number 13, the April 1971 adventure issue. He wasn't particularly interested and initially turned down the job, until Gross offered him $1,200 to paint it, a fairly modest fee at the time for a magazine illustration, but more than twice what Frazetta was then getting to do book covers. The offer of $1,200 suddenly made Frank very interested, and he invited Michael to come to his house in Brooklyn. He didn't want to come into the office for one thing, because he was too busy, Gross remembered. He was glad to have me to his house, and I was glad to go. I was shocked to find that Frank was so Italian and an old-fashioned Brooklyn guy. The direction was to create a generic man's adventure type of cover. It didn't have to be funny, and taking inspiration from the numerous jungle movies he'd seen over the years, Frank produced the cover that he called Desperation, but which the Lampoon writers titled White Man's Wet Dream in the editorial. When the deadline arrived, Michael drove back to my grandparents' house to pick up the painting. When I was leaving, he tore the pencil and watercolor rough that I had approved out of his notebook and handed it to me as a gift, as long as I promised not to tell Ellie. Typical of Frank, he painted the cover in oils. I don't think he ever used acrylics, and he used a cobalt dryer on it, and I delivered it to the office still wet. I remember getting that proof and walking around showing it off. I was so proud of it because it was a beautiful cover. Later that same year, he commissioned Frank to create an interior cover for a comic parody illustrated by Neil Adams, Dragula, for the November 1971 horror issue. Rather than a painting, he provided an ink drawing. The comic tells the story of a gay vampire whose bite turns his victims into, you guessed it, gay vampires, and he is being tracked down by a vivacious woman investigator. Frank's next cover was for the June 1972 science fiction issue and featured a crucified alien. And Ellie was not happy about this painting. She felt that it was mocking Christianity, which, in a roundabout way, it probably was. And though she liked Michael, she began having serious reservations about Frank continuing to work for the Lampoon. As he sometimes did, my grandfather reworked the painting after publication, making the alien even more human, and upset my grandma all over again. Frank's final two artworks for the Lampoon appeared in 1973 as the cover for the August Strange Beliefs issue, a mixed media piece generally known to fans today under the title of Ghoul Queen. And he provided an ink drawing for the back cover of the book, the National Lampoon's Encyclopedia of Humor. Given its anarchist counterculture leanings, people who knew my grandfather were a little surprised that he ever worked for the Lampoon. He was in his 40s when he accepted his first assignment, and though he was never particularly political, he was definitely very conservative in his views about pretty much everything except sex, as everyone might imagine looking at his work. When asked why he created art for them, my grandpa said simply, well, they loved my art and they paid well. I didn't tell them to grow up, and they didn't lecture me about my views on Nixon. Michael Gross left National Lampoon in 1974, became the personal designer for John Lennon, was a consultant to the Muppets, and became the art director for Esquire magazine, as well as the design director for Mobil Oil. Peter Kleinman succeeded Gross as the art director at the Lampoon, and though he continued to use many of the cartoonists and illustrators Gross had originally hired, he never offered Grandpa any assignments, preferring instead to work extensively with Mara McAfee for many covers. Michael and my grandparents stayed in touch, and it was actually Gross who helped convince Esquire to profile my grandfather in their June 1977 issue. Though a million readers were probably exposed to Frank's art for the first time in Esquire, including, as I've mentioned elsewhere, Clint Eastwood, he wasn't especially happy with the article itself. Why? Well, let's just say that my grandpa was never 100% happy with anything anyone ever wrote about him. In 1980, Gross moved to California, where he became a producer for 5 TV shows and 11 films, including Heavy Metal, Ghostbusters, Ghostbusters 2, Kindergarten Cop, and Dave. He tried to hire my grandpa as the creature designer for the first Ghostbusters movie, but after the amount of work and disappointing box office receipts of Fire and Ice, he just wasn't interested in working with another film and passed. Michael ended up hiring Bernie Wrightson instead. In 1995, Gross left Hollywood, moved to Italy for several years with his wife, and pursued a career in painting. He eventually divorced, returned to California to create art, and worked as a teacher and museum curator. Michael died on November 16, 2015 in Oceanside, California from cancer at the age of 70. But that's not the entire story about Michael Gross's relationship with my grandparents, and I thought I'd close with one more today, just for fun. As Michael noticed during his first visit to my grandparents' house, Grandma Ellie was pretty religious. She wasn't really a churchgoer, and her beliefs weren't necessarily traditional Christian or followed any particular orthodoxy, but rather were something she came up with on her own after extensive readings of the Bible. At the same time, she was also a free thinker, someone who enjoyed life, and was naturally curious about a lot of things. And one of them she was curious about in the early 1970s was cannabis. They were always talking about pot on the news, and I figured the kids and their friends were going to be experimenting with it. I was curious and wanted to know what it was all about. Mike Gross was with the hippie Lampoon people at the time, so I figured he'd know about it and asked him when he was visiting once. Without the slightest hesitation, Michael gave Ellie several joints and explained how to smoke them with the condition that she not tell Frank where she got them. Remember that I said my grandfather was very conservative? He might have had a glass of wine once in a while or an occasional beer, but his drugs of choice were nicotine, caffeine, and sugar, and he strongly disapproved of pretty much everything else. So naturally, Ellie kept her gift from Gross a secret and smoked them when she was alone, and yes, enjoyed them very much. And that wasn't the end. She revealed to a friend, I started to receive an envelope in the mail every so often, and inside there would be 1 or 2 cigarettes with a note, "To Ellie from Santa." I thought that was great. However, Grandma revealed that the presents from Gross, all of which arrived in National Lampoon envelopes, didn't last long. Frank picked up the mail one day, saw the envelope, and opened it. He was furious and came rushing into the kitchen, waving it under my nose. "What the hell is this crap?" I kind of shrugged and said, "Pot? Who sent it to you?" And I told him the truth. Santa Claus? That was Grandma for you. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Frazetta Fridays with Frazetta Girls. If you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe. And if you want to learn more about my grandparents, please visit FrazettaGirls.com. Until next time.